going to pick up right where we left off. Going to try and get this engine out today, and we're going to start by draining the fluids. But first, I'm going to get this evap canister out of the way, and I'm just unplugging the horns to get started. And then I'm just going to start unbolting this evap canister. Then I'm going to drain the coolant. And here is a terrible picture of where you drain it. So it's a T-fitting with a hose on either side, and it's right behind the evap canister, right above the oil filter. Make sure you take the radiator cap off to let some air into the system. And what I've done is I've already dumped the drain pan, and now I'm pulling the drain plug for the oil. We're just going to drain the oil. And this here's the same oil filter wrench that I use for all of my Honda oil filters. And it actually fits on here, but there's something wrong. Like it keeps slipping and it's distorting the oil filter. The oil filter's super tight, and I end up just resorting to this giant pair of channel locks that I have. Take the oil filter off, dump it out. And then I just put the old oil filter back on just to keep dirt out of the engine and protect the threads until we can dismantle this engine for autopsy. Then I just go ahead and unbolt the horns and get those out of the way. And this is just some footage of how corroded the engine is, and soot it looks like, or maybe some major oil leak from the alternator shaft. Now I'm just removing the bracket for the evap canister that the drain for the coolant's attached to. Just taking the hoses off the ends. And now I'm just going to take off the lower half of the valve cover so I can access the spark plug wires and get the spark plug wires out of the way. And I just put some masking tape on them and number them. And you almost don't have to do this because the different lengths show you which spark plug they go to. And you guys, you can label as much or as little of the wiring harness as you want to. And I'm just going to go ahead and do the other side now. Then I go ahead and pull the foot pegs off because they cover up the mounts for the subframe, where the subframe bolts to the frame of the motorcycle. And I'm pulling off the rear brake lever. You may or may not have to do this, but I'm going to powder coat the brake lever. And now I start working on where the right side radiator bolts into the frame. You notice I put the radiator cap back on just to keep dirt out of the system. Now I'm taking the hoses off from the radiator. And the hose that goes into the back of the radiator on both sides was pretty stripped. I ended up having to use vice grips to get the hose clamp loose. And off it comes. And the same thing on the left side, where the radiator mounts to the frame. I don't know if I showed it or not. Of course, you have to unplug the radiator fans from the harness. Working on hose clamps. There's me unplugging the fan. Hose clamp. And off it comes. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is address what I believe is the most critical part of this whole enterprise. And the reason I say that is because it gets me every time. You need to take your throttle cables loose from the throttle body as soon as you can. Before you start taking the engine loose and moving everything around, you got to start taking these throttle cables loose. Now, usually I like to take engine mount bolts loose and kind of get a little wiggle in the engine, because it gives me extra room to get my hands in there and undo little plugs and things, and you'll see some of that. And usually I'm parting out the Goldwing and there's not much demand for used throttle cables. And so I just laugh at myself and say, oh, I ruined another throttle cable, and I throw them in the trash and I move on with my life. But in this case, we're replacing this engine. We want to put this bike back on the road, and I'm going to show you right now why it's critical that you get these throttle cables loose as soon as you can. The push cable for your throttle contains a switch called the cruise cancel switch here, and it's bolted to the frame not 3 inches from your throttle body. And the cable in between is only about 3 inches long. And if you unbolt your engine and start wiggling it around without taking this loose, you're going to damage this cable. And this is just one on eBay that's clearly done that, and it's stretched at both ends and it's pulled the sheathing apart on the cable, and you can see it right here. And this is exactly what you don't want to happen. So make sure that you take your throttle cables off as soon as you can. But also, on the Goldwing and most other bikes, the throttle cable routing is very particular, and if you don't get it right, then your throttle may not spring return when you let go of it, which is very dangerous. And I also struggled with this, putting this bike back together. So even though I have illustrations in the manual and I have video footage of everything I did, I still wish that I had better documented the throttle cable routing. And on the Goldwing, it's kind of a pain. It's more complicated than other bikes. So if there's one thing that I can say to you, it is to thoroughly document the routing of your throttle cables and get them loose as soon as you can. Also, when you're in this area, you want to unhook any electrical connectors like the throttle position sensor, the map sensor, and the idle air control valve, as well as any of these little vacuum lines that you need to get loose. And now I'm just taking the cable loose from the starter. I'm using my little screwdriver to pull the boot out of the way, and then I'm starting on the nut with this wrench. What I'm working on now is the splined connection where the shifter hooks into the engine, because I want to remove this left side subframe and the shifter is hooked to it. So I got to get this off of the engine. Lighting's a little better now so you can see it, what I'm working on. I just walk it off with the pry bar and off it comes. Then I'm using this awesome little Harbor Freight scissor transmission jack just to support the engine while I unbolt the motor mounts. And this is a special tool for undoing the jam nuts on the left side motor mounts where they clamp the engine. Honda has a part number, but I wanted them in 2 days and for a third of the price, so I bought them on Amazon. I'll try to remember to put a link in the description or in a pinned comment. I'm unhooking the wiring connector for the kickstand switch. Then I take the bolt out of these motor mounts. Then I take my spud and I back out this motor clamp. It's like a jack bolt that clamps the motor. There's some on the left side of this engine to kind of pinch the motor in the frame. And this won't come all the way out. You just back it out till it bottoms out and then you're done. And now I'm working on the subframe on the right hand side. Same thing, except it doesn't have any clamping bolts, any jack bolts into the engine. It just comes out. These upper motor mounts have a nut on the back side, so you have to use a wrench on the nut. This is another special tool for these jack nuts on these engine clamps. For lack of a better term, they just pinch the engine in between the frame. So I take the bolt out, then I put my spud in and back off this engine clamp. Now I'm taking off this injector cover and the stay for the radiator, and I've got to unplug the fuel injectors because they run through it. Then I do the same thing on the left hand side. I go and get my permanent marker, and I decide to forego the masking tape and just write the number directly on the boots for the electrical connectors. The front motor mounts have a nut on the back side. Then I got to adjust my jack to be able to release some tension on these motor mount bolts and pull them out. Put my spud in there and back the engine clamp off. Same thing on the right side motor mount. Now I'm just using my hoist to see if the engine's actually free. Okay, so I've actually done a pretty poor job of filming this. So here's the drawing. And what I'm doing is I'm removing the rear brake reservoir here to give me access to the cables and wires that are behind it, like the speed sensor that plugs into this boot up here, which is where we disconnected the oxygen sensor from earlier. I also unhooked the reverse switch here and the main engine ground cable here. Now I start working on the harness connector for the alternator, and you can see how it's helpful that I gave myself some extra play by having the motor loose. Then I start working on the cable, and I have the screwdriver to pry the boot back while I work on the nut. Then I just push the cable out of the way. Now I start working on the harness connectors under the front end. A bunch of them hook into this boot up under the front, including the gear position switch, the reverse limit switch, the reverse actuator, etc., and the evap purge solenoid. Then I start to work on these coolant hoses. My replacement engine still has these attached, but in this instance these are kind of trapped behind the coolant overflow reservoir, and I can't really see to get them loose. So I'm going ahead and taking them loose just to make it easier for me to pull the engine out. And they hook into like a T or a Y fitting on top of the engine. So I'm going to go ahead and take that fitting loose too, but when I install the new engine, all of this will already be attached. Then I'm going to pull the fuel lines through in between the swing arm and the frame. And there's a rubber boot to take loose, but the drive shift just slips right out the back of the engine and we're loose. And now I'm just seeing what's got us hung up. There's a little bit of the wiring sub harness that is kind of trapped under some coolant lines on top of the engine. And so I'm just gonna unplug them and feed them through. And once I've pulled them through, then we're finally free. Join us next time when we install the replacement engine.